transformation. We are thrilled to be part of the Race to Zero Dialogue's Regenerative Resilience Food Systems Day. The Global Alliance is a strategic alliance of philanthropic foundations working together and with others to transform food systems. Our work is guided by 7 indivisible principles: renewability, resilience, diversity, equity, healthfulness, inclusion, and interconnectedness. We like to say these are a set, not a menu. You can't pick and choose the ones you like or that are easiest. Instead, we as a global community need to advance these principles in our actions in a profound way that holds them all up in equal measure. Our mission is to leverage our resources and our networks to support this needed transformation. We believe that our unique contribution is to help forge new insights, convene system actors, and where possible, to stimulate action towards transformative change. We are thrilled to co-host this event with Salzburg Global Seminar, with whom we hosted a series of events earlier this year. Both our organizations strive to connect system actors that don't normally work together, creating a confluence of perspectives that can give way to real and lasting change. Our recent experience of holding events where the food and climate communities could connect showed us how dialogue can be used to facilitate much needed inquiry, to elevate convergences and divergences, and to build potential interest in collaborative action. It also inspired this very session. The reality of food systems transformation is that it's complex and it is very challenging, and it's absolutely fundamental to dealing with the crises we face, from climate change to hunger to global pandemics. Just 2 weeks ago, a study from the Oxford Martin School showed that even if all fossil fuel emissions stopped tomorrow, the food system's greenhouse gas emissions would still make the planet uninhabitable. Similarly, the findings of a recent IPBES pandemic report confirms that, quote, the same human activities that drive climate change and biodiversity loss also drive pandemic risk through their impacts on our environment, end quote. So food systems play a role in many of the great challenges we face, but they also provide brilliant pathways to solutions. Around the world, many thousands of initiatives are already challenging the status quo, telling new stories about the future of food and driving transformative systems change. They also show us that action on food systems is action on climate. Speaking just to the work of philanthropies and funders, just a small subset of the larger ecosystem actors around the world, but the world I know best, there are many initiatives that give me hope, especially as they gain momentum. There's the Agroecology Fund, which is focused on shifting the dominant narrative about food and hunger and offers pooled grant making to support agroecological solutions. There's FORA, the Funders for Regenerative Agriculture, a network in North America working to accelerate the emergence of regenerative agriculture, healthy soil, and working lands that support people and the planet. And there's the Transformational Investing in Food Systems Initiative, also known as TIFS, which seeks to catalyze investment in principle-based, agroecologically aligned food businesses that are economically viable and deliver sustainable impact. These are just a few, but they immediately show us what's possible and how we effectively invest in and support solutions for a better future of food. So as we look ahead to COP26, to the United Nations Food Systems Summit, and to the milestones of equally important global processes like the 47th Committee on World Food Security and COP15, we have real opportunities to advance the case for systemic solutions, to shift the narrative on food systems, and send a resounding signal to the world's governments to act for a healthy recovery, thereby changing the course of human, animal, and ecological health and well-being. We know this is possible. It's what we humans do well. We change the course of history, for better or for worse. This is our imperative today. We must change the course of history for the better and bend the arc of these events in a positive direction. So today we will hear from 5 inspiring speakers. We will then have a few responses from representatives from COP26 and the United Nations Food Systems Summit. And we hope that together with your participation, this dialogue can create space for engagement, for sharing ideas, and where possible to build critical mass around common calls to action as we head into 2021. We're excited to have all of you with us here today. Just some small bits of housekeeping before we move into the rest of our agenda. If you haven't already done so, you're invited to introduce yourself to other attendees in the chat box and to make comments also in the chat box. Please put questions you have in the Q&A box just to help us track those adequately. I would like to now pass the floor to a wonderful colleague with whom we have been working in the most thoughtful, supportive, and collaborative partnership, Claire Shine, who is the Vice President and Chief Program Officer, Salzburg Global Seminar. Claire, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be joined through the ether today for such an important conversation. And thank you too to the Race to Zero dialogue organizers. It's such an important step for us all to come together. We're delighted that Salzburg Global Seminar has partnered this year with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. By way of background, Salzburg Global is a completely independent nonprofit that was founded out of conflict at the end of the Second World War by 3 young people. We challenge current and future leaders to shape a more creative, just and sustainable world. And in our nearly 75 years, around 38,000 fellows from about 175 countries have come together through our work. The Sustainable Development Goals and climate action underpin everything we do. And we look across the divides, for example, focusing at the moment on ending pandemics and thinking of new paradigms to link human, animal, and ecological health. Ruth talked about systems transformation. We believe that means starting with systems, with people and organizations where they are, and building trust rather than stigmatizing. It isn't easy. It requires each of us to think about going beyond our training, our experience, our mandates, our reward systems. It requires listening, imagination, and courage. But as Ruth said, we can do it. The conversation today will include 5 stellar speakers who bridge very different life paths, sectors, and scales. We'll put a PDF with their bios into the chat box, so you'll be able to find out more about them and the work that they do as you go through. We're going to kick off with a 30-minute debate with the 5 speakers, followed by about 20 minutes of questions and answers with all of you. As you know, we asked everybody who registered to share answers to 2 questions. And I'm going to ask Jen now to put up the word cloud for the first question, which was, what are your hopes and expectations for the UN Food Systems Summit and COP26, either going into them or what you hope will come out of them? So for our first round of questions, I'm going to ask our speakers to keep their answers very brief. I'll call first from the climate perspective on Teresa Anderson, who is the Climate Policy Coordinator for Action Aid International. And she's focusing in the UN climate negotiations on protecting the rights, land and livelihoods of vulnerable farming communities. Teresa, a quick answer to that first question, please.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much to the organisers for this great and really timely event, really a great opportunity to bring these perspectives together, so thank you. So on the great question on what our hopes and expectations are for the Food Summit and the COP26, I think it's important to register that smallholder farmers are the ones who really do feed the world, and these are the ones that have been systematically exploited and marginalised by agribusiness, whose model has actually failed to feed the world. In spite of all the land, in spite of all the subsidies that large-scale agriculture has been given over the decades, they have still failed to feed the world. And in fact, industrial agribusiness has been harming ecosystems and the climate and driving aggressive concentration of land and wealth and contributing to the pandemics that we find ourselves in now. So the IPCC special report on land, which came out last year, made it really clear that to address both climate change and food security, we really do need to shift to agroecological models of farming that support smallholder farmers, especially women smallholder farmers who hold up half the sky. And the COP26 negotiations on agriculture really need to take forward the findings of the IPCC special report on land and put in place guidelines or a framework that really helps to encourage a shift from global industrial agriculture to agroecological methods and less and better meat. And this shift needs to be really guided by just transition principles that do a number of things that helps to address and not exacerbate inequalities. We need to transform our food systems to work for people, nature, and the climate. We need to make sure that the processes to shape transition plans are genuinely inclusive and participatory. And we need to make sure that the planning and policy frameworks that enable this shift are really comprehensive to support communities to themselves to make those shifts as needed. So that's what I would love to see the future big global discussions leading towards. Sorry, you're muted, Claire.
My apologies, everybody. I'm so well trained by now. Now I'll bring in the perspective as André Guimarães on conservation and the low carbon economy. André is the executive director of the Amazon Environmental Research Institute, and he's the co-facilitator of the Brazilian Coalition on Climate, Forests and Agriculture. André, a quick first round on your hopes.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much for the organizers and for inviting me here today. This is an extremely important conversation we're having here today. Well, my take on this, Claire, is very simple. I think we are in front of a paradigm shift. And the expectation that we have looking from Brazil, looking from the Amazon to the problem of the balance between deforestation or fighting deforestation and producing more food, it's actually, from our standpoint, is a fake battle. We actually have to find a way to balance those. We need to produce more food at the same time that we protect more the environment, and at the same time that we protect more the human rights. So all these things, they have to happen together. The way that we have been developing ourselves and our economies up until now is not going to be the way that we will develop our economies from now on. We are facing a number of new pressures from consumers, from voters, from societies in general, from the geopolitics in the world. And we have to reshape the way that we relate ourselves with nature. And very quickly, let me give the Brazilian example, which I think it's an interesting one to share with the audience here. I mean, 40, 50 years ago, Brazil was a net importer of food. Today, 40, 50 years later, Brazil is number 1, 2, or 3 in the key most traded commodities in the world. Brazil is one of the 23 countries that do produce food for its population and a surplus to export. And this is a very successful story indeed, and I'm very proud of it. But there was a price tag associated to this process. We lost half of the central savannas biome that we have in Brazil, the Cerrado. We lost roughly 20% of the Amazon. Many traditional communities have lost their lands. Many indigenous communities have lost their lives and their cultural structures. So there was a cost associated to this process. It can't continue the way it is from now on. So that's what we do, Claire, at the Brazilian Coalition on Climate, Forest and Agriculture. We basically group together different perspectives from the private sector, from the financial sector, from the civil society, from academia, from the governments and the different agencies of the government, and we try to come up with convergence. We try to come up with solutions that would allow us to go the next level, which means produce more in the same area and conserve more and protect more civil and human rights. That's what the coalition is aiming at, and that's what we believe needs to be done from now on in the food industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, André. That's a great moment for me to bring in the perspective of Indigenous peoples with Andrea Carman. She has been the executive director for nearly 30 years of the International Indian Treaty Council, which represents Indigenous people from North, Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean and Pacific. So Andrea, I know you have some photographs to accompany your introductory words.
Thank you so much, and Leosim Chaniawo, Umawayaim, respectful greetings to all of you. Regarding our hope hopes and expectations for the Global Food Summit. Indigenous peoples have always, since we've been coming together now for more than 20 years to talk about food sovereignty, maintained, as the slide shows, that food sovereignty is a prerequisite for food security. And our definition of food sovereignty is affirming a rights-based and a culturally based approach based on Indigenous peoples' rights, as was referred to. We can't be sacrificed for any greater cause because our ability to protect the world's biodiversity, the United Nations maintains that 80% of the remaining global biodiversity is on Indigenous peoples' lands. And we have also time-tested methods, our original seeds, our ways of knowing, our relationships based on our cultures and traditional practices are essential for adaptation to climate change, as well as for sustaining our ability to feed ourselves and our communities. And it's recognized by Indigenous peoples as well as the United Nations that climate change poses the single greatest threat to food security in the future for all peoples. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has finally, after many, many years of activism and resistance by Indigenous peoples, recognized the importance of Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge, including our knowledge in food systems, to adaptation and mitigation of climate change through the creation of the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, which I'm honored to be the chair of this year. And that is based on an equal participation and equal voice of state representatives and Indigenous peoples representatives, and based on our right to free, prior, informed consent, which is affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. All of these elements need to be central for our participation to be meaningful and effective in the Food Summit and our contributions to be respected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. And that takes me neatly to Saswati Bora, who represents the perspective of food systems innovation, leading on that agenda for the World Economic Forum, and also leading their food and agriculture work in India. Saswati.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very important discussion. My hope for both the UN Food Systems Summit and at COP26 will be that both these major milestones will work towards adopting a more holistic and integrated systems approach that examines both the food and climate systems as a whole rather than in separate parts. Because we know that to nutritiously and sustainably feed almost 10 billion people by 2050, food systems will probably need to meet 4 key objectives. It will need to be sustainable to minimize the negative environmental impacts, conserve biodiversity and natural resources, and strengthen resiliency against future shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic. It'll also need to be nutritious and healthy. It needs to provide and promote consumption of healthy food for a healthy diet. It will need to be efficient to minimize food loss and waste. And as Teresa mentioned, it needs to be inclusive. It has to bring in the perspectives and bring economic and social inclusion for smallholder farmers, Indigenous people, women, and youth. So my hope is that at least the UN Food Summit will bring an understanding on what do we mean by an integrated food systems vision and what are the approaches, focusing on some of the key pathways that through collective multi-stakeholder action could lead us to some positive, tangible change for both the people and planet. And for the COP26, I hope it also recognizes the larger role of food systems to meet climate objectives beyond just looking at production and land use to really encompass food loss and waste and also sustainable consumption. And so that would probably mean that both the UN Food Systems Summit and the COP26 needs to examine the synergies and possible trade-offs between climate objectives, health objectives, socioeconomic and livelihood objectives, and find pathways through collective action and collaboration. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Saswati. And then our fifth speaker, Million Belay, has just joined. Million really brings in the perspective of food sovereignty, so great timing. He's the coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, which brings together diverse civil society organizations spanning small-scale farmers and pastoralists to consumer movements and indigenous peoples. Million, some brief words for your first contribution, please.
I'm sorry, I'm just coming from another meeting, so I'm a bit confused of what I'm going to say now. How many minutes is this?
You could just give me a couple of brief comments about your hopes for the COP26 of the Food Systems Summit. Then I'll let you take your breath and bring you back in a few moments.
Okay. I think for both COP26, not for COP26, but for the World Food Summit, as you know, we found as a civil society group the whole process challenging. Our hope would be to just go back and rewire the whole process. We know this is not possible, but that's our big hope, because I was just participating in some of the events like the country level negotiation setup, how it's going to run. And I could feel that it would be a really, really rushed process. I was not sure how much real people, the majority of the people in the world who are producing food, processing food, and have webs of interaction around food system will be participating in how all of the setup in the platforms and the resources would be available to them. And I could feel that this is a Northern Hemisphere led agenda still, that's what I feel now, the whole thing. So I don't know. That's I don't have a message, only concern probably, but yeah. I'll speak to this much more when I come later.
Well, Million, you very neatly brought us to the second question that the audience as well as our speakers were asked, which was, in areas of divergence or tension, what are the opportunities for convergence and potential collective action? Jen, perhaps you could bring up that word cloud of some of the feedback that we had from participants on what they saw as both divergence and convergence. And Million just touched on something very important. Are we talking past or are we talking to? Because that is a key part of moving from divergence to convergence. So now I'd like to get another round of inputs and perhaps play with the order, bringing in first Andre with the perspective from Amazonia on conservation and the low carbon economy. Andre, some brief comments for you about how we get to workable points of convergence in these two processes.
Thank you, Claire, for the question. Let me answer that with an example, something that has happened with us here about 5-6 years ago. The year was 2014. We were 1 year away from the Paris meeting, the COP in Paris, late December that took place in December of 2015. So 1 year before that, the civil society in Brazil was very concerned about the quality of the INDC that the federal government would be presenting in Paris. There was a concern that it would be a weak one. The civil society was concerned that that would be a weak INDC. At the same time, the private sector, particularly the agribusiness sector, was very concerned also that Brazil would present a very rigorous INDC and they would have to pay the bill at the end of the day. So there was a concern from civil society, different from the concern from the private sector. But at some point in time, in late 2014, these two interests sat down around the table and decided to work together. Because they said, well, this is something that interests both sides. And we need to come to a convergence. Otherwise, the government will present something that's going to be bad for both sides. So we need to sit down, negotiate, find a way, engage with the state, with the government, and move on with the agenda. So I think that's an example, Claire, of how important it is to make sure that you understand what is it that the other side wants. And at the end of the day, we were able not just to come up with an agreement between these two sides of the equation, but that understanding, that agreement have created the Brazilian Coalition on Climate, Forest and Agriculture, which is now celebrating its 5th year of existence, and has been working with different governments, state level governments, private sector, financial sector, and so on, to do the same thing, to try to merge to bring convergence to the dialogue and try to come up with solutions that are important for both sides. And just to finalize, the main objective of the coalition is to stop illegal deforestation and produce more food in the Brazilian croplands and pasture lands. That's simple to observe, very complex to implement. We need to have the spaces, we need to have the dialogue spaces in which we build consensus and converge to objectives that are common to both or to the different sides.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me bring in Teresa now from the climate perspective.
Thank you so much. It's another good question. And for a bit of background, well, I do want to flag to everybody listening here, actually, that it is very important that those of us that are working on the issues of food, land, indigenous rights and farmers have this conversation about net zero targets on our radar. It poses potential immense threats if not done right. And I feel that this is a good space to talk about this now, because we do need to find the right kind of action to move forward. We do need to collectively scrutinize this flurry of net zero targets that are coming out by governments and corporations right now before we accept them at face value. We really need to start looking out for the net part of the net zero targets, because almost all net zero targets are relying far too heavily on offsetting or negative emissions technologies, and with far too distant 2050 goals. But these huge net components really disguise, first of all, a lack of transformative action to address greenhouse gases. And all of these offsetting dependence really adds up to a huge and unrealistic expectation for carbon offsetting and reliance on negative emission technologies such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which will either not work, or if it does, will drive massive land grabs if it does. So we're basically damned if it works and damned if it doesn't work. There is simply not enough land on the planet to meet all of the corporate and government offsetting targets combined within these net zero goals. So more is definitely not better when it comes to all this netting out. We're going to see the vulnerable communities who've done the least to cause the problem, the climate problem, who already face the worst impacts, being pushed off the land, just as with the previous biofuel land grab that we've seen over the last decade, but potentially orders of magnitude bigger, which should raise real flags for many of us. So if we're going to have a chance of meeting the 1.5 goal, we really need to push for climate targets that require real transformation of our food, our energy, our transport, construction and economic systems that bring actual emissions down, and that have ambitious milestone targets for 2025 and 2030 with no offsets or reliance on dangerous negative emissions technologies. So we all need to be getting behind the call for action for real zero greenhouse gases, and better scrutinizing the net zero targets before celebrating. And this means that those of us that work in the food sector have to reach out to push for ambition in other sectors too. And that's where there's real potential for collaboration for greater ambition.
Great, thanks, Teresa. That's a great moment to bring in Saswati there, who works at the level of food systems innovation. You heard there about the questioning of the way targets are set and the risk of land grabs. How does that look from the perspective of the World Economic Forum, Saswati?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we are realizing more and more right now is that we require sort of a fundamental change in the way our food is produced, including the practices of more than 500 million smallholder farmers around the world, and the way food is consumed, which is like the consumption patterns of now more than 7 billion individuals worldwide. And that requires several transitions to more sustainable supply chains, to greater production efficiency, to more biodiversity resilience, to healthier diets and inclusive livelihoods. But I think the question, right, is who pays for these transitions? What are the incentives that can overcome the hurdles that are preventing stakeholders from making this change? So we really need to focus on incentives that can address these transition costs, the cost of behavior change, that can fill knowledge and awareness gaps, and really be powerful enough to change the mindsets of billions of individuals. And so I think one of the biggest opportunities, and perhaps also one of the most challenging aspects of it, is to realign incentives to build climate and food systems which are fit for the future. So because many of the current incentive mechanisms, whether it's the subsidies or business models that are in place, were put in place decades back when some of the imperatives for at least countries were food security and self-sufficiency. But now that we know that the world has moved towards a more holistic and integrated understanding of food systems, and we know that it has to meet the aspirations for both healthy people and a sustainable planet, we really need to look at repurposing existing incentives and create new ones where needed. So recently, earlier this year, we launched a report which looked at incentives for food systems transformation. We highlighted the role of public investments and public policies, which we believe could be one of the biggest drivers of food rapid and widespread change. We looked at the role of shifting consumer demand, the role of businesses and institutional investors. But I think what our main point is that all of these pathways are interconnected, and we need progress against all of them to support the goal of realigning incentives. And we also need to understand that there will be trade-offs between many of these interconnected outcomes within food systems. For example, for higher cost of producing environmentally and socially responsible goods may make it more expensive for consumers. So how does governments come in and provide adequate safety nets to protect vulnerable consumers? At the same time, it might lead to loss of income for some producers if we have to move them to more sustainable practices. So how do we ably compensate them to make that transition? So I think from my perspective, the role of multi-stakeholder collective action, whether it's countries, civil society organization, private sector, donors, farmer organizations, will be required both at the global and regional level, but also at the country level to really induce this change.
Great. Thank you so much, Saswati. I want to bring in Milion now from the perspective of food sovereignty. Where do you see the opportunities, convergence, particularly because you highlighted what you see as the imbalance with the global north under the current status quo?
Yeah, I think in terms of opportunity, this would have been a fantastic opportunity, honestly, because the UN has a power of bringing in everybody on the table, and there's a lot of support for this, as we see. So if we could bring, those who are concerned about the crisis in the food system that we are facing around the table and have a serious discussion about the power imbalance that we are seeing, because in the food system as it is now, there are very, very powerful interests who are really are interested in tinkering, the corners of the problem, not really addressing the fundamental transformational change. So if we could bring them, and especially if we could give a chance to those who are producing food, processing food, and those webs of relationships, if we could bring them together, and if we could analyze also the policy incoherence that's existing in almost every country, even at the higher level, that would have been fantastic. I'm just coming from another African Union event, and there is a recognition there that even policies at that level, policies related to food, are very much incoherent. So if these kinds of spaces could give us an opportunity to talk about those policy incoherences, if they could encourage, the democratic participation of the people, that would have been a fantastic opportunity.
Brilliant. That's a good moment for me to bring in Andrea, who represents Indigenous peoples. And Andrea, just a brief answer, please, so that we can move on towards the questions and answers.
Thank you. There are several concerns that have been raised here by previous speakers, things like carbon offsets, market-based solutions, that we're very concerned are taking too prominent a role in the planning for the Global Food Summit. the relationship, with all due respect, with the World Economic Forum seems to put the focus on large-scale food production. There's a recent expression of partnership between the multinational conglomerate of pesticide corporations, CropLife, and UNFCCC, which is very concerning. You can see this is, my own Yaqui community, and a lot of these pesticides have been banned for use by the exporting country, but are still sent and sprayed on our children, our families, with resulting, deaths, birth defects, and cancers. And these elements coming into the discussion about the global food systems is very concerning for Indigenous peoples vis-a-vis the summit coming up, and whether the promotion of market-based solutions, of large-scale production. We've heard about trade-offs, but Indigenous peoples' rights and lands can't be what's traded off for global and corporate solutions, which are not really solutions at all. They're perpetuating the very violations of our rights, as well as the global climate and food crisis. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I want to close at the end of this section with asking for a one-word call to action, or a short call to action to the organizers. But first, I'd like to dive straight into some questions coming from the group. The first, trying to read out of the corner of my eye, is to Seswati, thinking about that issue about negative externalities and the true cost of how we actually price food production and the negative environmental externalities. It's not, of course, a question only for Seswati, but I'd like to start with you and then broaden it to the whole group, if I may.
Sure. And what exactly is the question on the negative externality?
I'm just trying to bring it back up in the chat box. Please excuse me. I'm trying to read out of the corner of my eye. There we are. What is Seswati's view on how to internalize negative externalities in food pricing, rather than accepting that food which is better for people and planet and farm animals has to be more expensive? I think this perhaps should be taken in the context also of some of the comments that Milion and others raised about what is perceived as the big power imbalance between small versus huge industrial food producers. Is that enough for you to get your teeth into an answer?
Yeah, I think there's been a huge discussions recently among the global community to really look at what is the true cost of food, and really trying to factor in some of the negative externalities. And I think from that perspective, there is also a lot of discussion ongoing right now to really look at supporting governments to figure out what is the true cost of food, to really look at what are the key aspects of evidence that would be needed to help support them to make those policy decisions, which will help them to provide better, probably sustainable, support sustainability or nutrition outcomes in their policy decisions. And there is, I think, what we really need is probably in some level of there's a lack of evidence for what kind of interventions would be good in a certain country or regional context, and I think that would require to build the capacity building of countries and governments so that they can formulate policies which can really take into account the true cost of food, which means that they would probably need to really be provided with the talent, tools, and technical skills, including data and methodologies that will help them to make those informed decisions. I know there is a lot of work on creating the framework that can help governments and to make those decisions, but then again, each country will have to choose their own bespoke model which meets their own national priorities and make those decisions based on their policy priorities. So but what would be really helpful if the UN Food System Summit or others could create sort of a capacity where or for support for countries who are many of them lacking to make these kind of informed policy decisions where they can integrate the true cost of food in their kind of policy decisions.
Thank you. Let me bring Andre here, because you spoke earlier about how civil society and private sector interests had found a way of collaborating more productively. I'd like to hear you give your reflections on that question, but in the specific context of coalition building for change, which involves, as I understood it, changing the power dynamics in this space as well.
I would like to build on Saswati's comment when it comes to incorporating the externalities into the financial equations. I think, and that's pretty much what we're discussing at the coalition. There's a lot of subsidies, billions and billions of financial incentives for the business as usual agriculture, for example, and that's the sector that we work on at the coalition. So there are huge incentives for the business as usual, for expanding. In other words, let me put it in very simple words. I do subsidize chainsaws with my taxpayer money to chop down trees in the Amazon today, in 2020. In November of 2020, that's what's happening in my country. So we do have to stop that. I mean, we do have to convert or to somehow rechannel those subsidies and incentives to make sure that the forests are standing. The problem that we have in the Amazon, for example, and that goes for the tropical forests in general, is that standing forests do not have a value. I mean, for me, there's a big value, but for the economy in general, you have to remove that forest to perform any kind of activity, and that paradigm is wrong. We need to rechannel the resources, rechannel the incentives so that the forests are kept standing at the same time that you produce more and that you have more access to technology, more access to credit lines and technical assistance to perform your activity. That goes straight to the smallholders system of production in the Amazon, for example. There are 7,000 smallholders in the Amazon. They occupy an area the size of France, about 55, 60 million hectares. Half of that land is already chopped down, is already deforested. And for one reason, these farms, these groups of people, they have no access to capital, they have no access to technology, they have no access to infrastructure. The only capital they have is the natural capital, and that's what they use to live. So the equation is totally upside down. We do need to provide the means through incentive, through technical assistance, so that the smallholders, the traditional producers, the agriculture that really supplies food to our tables is going in the right direction. Incentives need to be rethought and need to be rechanneled so that we promote intensification instead of extensification of our agricultural systems. Once again, as I said at the beginning, the way that we brought ourselves up until this point is not going to be the way that we'll continue to grow our economies, to grow our food production systems in the future. We have to redesign that. Incentives and subsidies are a fundamental piece in these processes, and incorporating the externalities into the decision-making processes, particularly the social and environmental externalities, it seems to be obvious.
Thank you, Andre. So running through this whole debate is a really loud focus on the need for holistic, multi-layered approaches. And although we've only heard one or two references to it, clearly the intersect of planetary and human health is absolutely fundamental. I'd like to bring Teresa in at this point, because we've also heard that concepts and ideas that seem to be the brave new world are now being roundly critiqued in some areas, nature-based solutions, the words around net zero, etc. Why are so many groups, Teresa, concerned around nature-based solutions, carbon offsetting, and so on?
Well, the nature-based solutions discussion has been very interesting. It emerged just over a year ago as a potential new exciting way to bring together the discussions about ecosystems, the discussions about climate, and potentially agriculture together. And as ActionAid, we were quite excited initially about the potential for this to create a space to really energize conversations about agroecology, about the role, recognizing that indigenous peoples and safeguarding indigenous rights is one of the most effective ways to safeguard the world's critical biodiverse ecosystems, eco-based adaptation. There could, in theory, have been a lot of great discussion under the banner of nature-based solutions. Unfortunately, the way that the conversation has been taken forward quite aggressively is by big actors like, Shell Oil and BP and others, really capturing that conversation so that the way that almost everyone now thinks about nature-based solutions is nature-based solutions to our problem of the fact that we want to continue polluting. So it's like nature-based solutions to what exactly? Well, in their framing, it's nature-based solutions to pollution. And that's not really how many of us would have chosen to use that framing. We would have, ideally we would have just said nature rather than solution to your problem. But because nature has now become a solution to somebody else's problem, we have a lot of pressure on how ecosystems can play that role, how they have to play that role, the defining of ecosystems as Shell's territory to fix the climate. And that's not what we need to do. We need to be pushing Shell to absolutely transform, or ideally become irrelevant, because we want to see fossil fuels out of the picture. We don't want to be legitimizing fossil fuels through the use of ecosystems. So that's why nature-based solutions and offsetting is becoming a real problem.
Great, thank you very much. And that's triggered more questions in the chat box here from Marita Johansson. I'm just extracting from this question because I want to put this out to Milion and to Andrea. Today's broken food systems are a major driver accelerating humanitarian needs, including acute food insecurity in war-torn societies. Can we work towards joining the big dots for the various stakeholders not part of the dialogue? So first, Milion, with your African insights, and then we'll wrap up with Andrea from the Indigenous Nations perspective, please. Milion.
I'm not understanding the question very well, to be honest.
This is making the link between broken food systems and drivers of conflict. I think everybody on this call will know that climate itself is a threat multiplier. The climate conflict link is very strong in the future. And here we have our questioner also talking about acute food insecurity in war-torn societies and the humanitarian nexus. Does that help you?
Yeah, I think that's an area which needs we're really looking into what causes those conflicts. Is very much important. There are so many reasons, but taking people's spaces, food producing spaces for other purposes can also elicit conflict. That we know conflicts in Nigeria, in Niger Delta. We know why that has happened. We know that there are places where large-scale agriculture is being implemented and people are moved out of their land, and because of that, there's conflict. Conflict has so many entries, and it's very difficult to connect every kind of conflict with the food system, but a number of them are because of the mismanagement of the kind of food system, and our understanding of the kind of food system that's happening at the local community level, that's creating these conflicts. That's what I see. But once conflict occurs, obviously it's very difficult to go to farm and to go to markets, and it's a lot of displacements for people. And it increases pressure also on the natural areas. Also, when people are displaced and go to forests in natural areas, they put a lot of strain in these areas. So one conflict occurs, obviously the food system is all upside down. And by the way, these conflicts are sometimes used to get people used to some kind of food also. The food that comes through aid becomes the main food when the conflict is over, and is how they promote certain kinds of food also. We can mention so many examples. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, Andrea, can I come back to you, where we were talking the question looking at humanitarian needs and the importance of engaging stakeholders who are not sufficiently part of this dialogue.
Thank you. I would like to comment, on some of the terminologies that we tend to use. Indigenous peoples maintain that we are actually rights holders rather than stakeholders. And too often we talk about, destroying forests, but we forget that indigenous peoples live in this forest since time immemorial, and they're also being destroyed. I want to comment, also to add to Teresa's comments on nature-based solutions, because indigenous peoples were always puzzled by that terminology, and it speaks to, as you said, the holistic approach and actually a change, a transformative change in the way that we interact with the natural world, because all solutions are nature-based and we are part of nature. And the fact, as Teresa commented, that people are looking at nature as an other to be able to provide solutions removes us from the realization that we are part of nature. And unless we realize that, we're going to be increasingly threatened as a species, as a human species. And I think the pandemic is also, showing us that disconnect without realizing what we're doing to the natural world and what we've done to put us in a very vulnerable situation. We have seen the concept of nature-based solutions be utilized to support this idea of carbon offsets, forest offsets, those kinds of concepts, which are not solutions at all, and in fact directly threaten the survival of indigenous peoples and the planet as a whole. So with holistic solutions, I think we have to come together as a human family, but also realize that we are fundamentally part of nature. We are part of the natural world, and we need to be part of the solution as well by taking all of the rights holders as well as stakeholders onto the table where solutions are being discussed.
Thank you so much. So there's a very rich debate getting underway in the chat box. Everyone is always shy at the beginning. So please feel free to be giving answers, web links and resources in that chat box. I can't get to all of it, very sadly. What I want to do is to close this part of the agenda with one brief call to action from each of our 5 speakers to the organizers of the UN Food Systems Summit and COP26. And we just heard about this idea of one human family. In one sense, that was the ideal at the founding of the UN and of all the different multilateral processes. It can sometimes feel hard to grasp now, but is this pandemic with the associated threat multipliers a chance for us to really get real again about that interdependence, including across borders? So I'm going to pick out of the blue, I'm going to start with Milion and then pass to Saswati and then to the rest of our speakers. Your one brief call to action for the organizers of these 2 processes. Milion.
What a difficult question.
It's a very hard question.
Very, very hard. I mean, I think to slow it down a little bit and involve people, involve others, involve civil society in the right way. That's the only thing that I can say.
Okay. Saswati.
I think my call to action would be to encourage a holistic systems approach for both of the organizers of the Food Systems Summit and COP26, and really look at realigning incentives through inclusive collective action, and really to recognize the dynamism of food systems. We know that farmers can provide elegant solutions to the challenge of transformation. They can make agriculture more renewable, beneficial, and sustainable. But if we find pathways for consumers to reward farmers for producing more nutritious and sustainable food, I think we could be really looking at realigning the incentives and also really looking at recognizing the dynamism of food systems.
Excellent, thank you. Andrea.
Thank you. I think it's important that the organizers step back and challenge some of the assumptions about reliance on industrial and economic-based food systems. because that's not what feeds the world, as many have pointed out here. And also bring diverse food producers to the table from the beginning, from the planning stages, not just plug us in as speakers when the event happens. We have something to contribute. We want to share as Indigenous peoples, but it needs to be done in a respectful, rights-based framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Andre.
Hard to speak after Andrea. First of all, let me second that, Andrea. Absolutely right. But in addition to that, my suggestion would be to, on one hand, factor in the so-called environmental and social externalities into the cost equation of food production on one hand, and on the other hand, make sure that those additional resources are fairly distributed to make sure that the environment is protected and human rights are indeed also respected.
Thank you. And Teresa.
Yeah, I think my comments to the Food Systems Summit, but could also apply more largely, would be to really ensure that this, echo Andrea on that this needing to be a rights-based process, because when you don't center the right to food and you center corporations in the mix, the vision gets very lost. But in addition, one of the criticisms that's apparent around the Food Systems Summit is that it's trying to pick and choose which civil society organizations get to speak on behalf of the world, instead of like really working with the framework of the Committee on World Food Security and the civil society mechanism, in which farmers, movements and NGOs have themselves decided who's going to represent them and what their messages are. So to address these criticisms, the Food Systems Summit really needs to work more closely with the CFS and reference its various tools, bring in the CFS chair, for example, to the advisory committee, listen closely to the CSM in the way that the CSFF, listen to the civil society groups in the way that the Committee on World Food Security does, and recognize the wealth of rooted insights that farmers, movements and civil society can give to this process, rather than just picking the people that get to speak on their behalf. But I think those apply widely as well, not just to the Food Systems Summit.
I think that's right. In a sense, you've just reminded us of a blueprint for effective multilateral and multi-stakeholder negotiations. So wrapping up this part of the programme and recognising that, of course, a vast amount is in the chat box rather than being a recap right here. Teresa's final comments reminded me, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, as we sometimes hear said, undercutting a lot of the conversation related to power and the shifting dynamics between people and power, not only in a democratic sense, but also the whole way in which choices are made and resources are allocated. We heard some interesting calls to action or key points there from Milion. The importance of slow. We sometimes at Salzburg Global hear ourselves called slow food for the mind. And it can be so hard in a world on speed to think about the complexity and multi-layeredness of systems change. Seswati was eloquent about the importance of holistic approaches that really understand the shifting dynamics and perhaps also respect where change is happening within those systems and how we can optimize those change trajectories. Andrea spoke importantly about challenging assumptions which underlie so much of the way we do business legitimately, our norms, our parameters, as I said at the beginning, and in particular highlighted the importance of respect and a rights-based approach as part of that new paradigm. And Andre, of course, speaking to the question of externalities and negative externalities, which gave rise to one of the really important conversations running through the Q&A. For myself, I hear how terms, concepts, and initiatives that seem to carry great hope and optimism can then show their cracks as they start to be put into practice. And that eternal vigilance is also part of the spirit of collective intelligence, appreciative inquiry that we're all engaged in. It's brilliant now to hand back to Ruth, because she's going to be speaking to those on the very front line of these two international processes, Nigel Topping and Martin Frick. So Ruth, the screen is yours again.
Great, thank you so much, Claire, and really fantastic discussion amongst the 5 speakers and also in the chat box and the Q&A box. So thank you everybody for really weighing in on this. I just want to hold up what I heard just in terms of kind of convergences and divergences very quickly. I think in terms of convergences, I mean, everybody's calling for a desire for a more healthy, nutritious, sustainable, and low carbon food system. You know, I think there's sort of common threads around the fact that the global industrial system is not fit for purpose. And there are multiple pathways to get there, but we've heard a lot about agroecology and regenerative agriculture, the importance of indigenous people and smallholder farmers, and that those principles that I mentioned at the beginning of the call have been highlighted by each of the speakers, particularly inclusion, equity, food sovereignty, just transition, human rights, very strong themes around the need to ground jotted down a quick list. It will not be comprehensive. But for instance, realigning incentive mechanisms, concerns around net zero and carbon offsets, real concerns around inclusive and participatory processes, especially with underrepresented voices like women, smallholder farmers, indigenous people in the global South. There was talk about false arguments and the real need for holistic analysis and systemic solutions. Of course, there's some concern around power imbalances and policy incoherence. This sort of reminds me that at the Global Alliance, we use something called Blue Marble evaluation, and maybe one of my colleagues could pop that, a link to that in the chat box. Blue Marble evaluation is an approach to evaluation that is fundamentally anchored in systems thinking and breaking down silos, integrating sort of separated functions, connecting people and places and creating linkages over time. And one of the guiding principles of Blue Marble evaluation is that tensions can't always be resolved, but they can be held and they can be elevated as the basis for working toward understanding and possible breakthrough solutions. So taking this principle and all that was heard in the previous session and looking ahead to next year's global processes, let's now turn to this session to hear from Martin Frick and Nigel Topping for their responses and where they see opportunities for alignment and potential collective action. So first, just brief introduction, and I think the full bios are in the chat box. Martin Frick is deputy to the Special Envoy for the UN Food Systems Summit 2021. Nigel Topping is high-level climate champion of the UK for COP26. And just to say on this, that the role of the high-level champion is to strengthen collaboration and drive action from business, investors, organizations, cities, and regions on climate change, and coordinate this work with governments and parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So Martin, I'd like to start with you. Responding to the hopes and the concerns raised during the previous panel discussion, what is the Secretariat of the United Nations Food Systems Summit doing to support collaboration? And what channels are there for non-state actors to engage and influence discussions amongst policymakers?
Thank you, Ruth. And let me start by what we are not doing. We are not cooking any policy outcome with any big players. We are not driving a secret agenda. I think one of the main fundamental misunderstandings is that because the Secretary General has announced this process a year ago and a full year has passed, that basically everything has already been discussed and cleared. And now I heard the allegation that we would just bring stakeholders in to make this thing look good. Honestly, our action tracks have started right now. It has taken an awful long time. One of the reasons was COVID, and other reasons were all the political mechanics behind getting the different regional group to nominate their actors for the advisory group. This is all unfortunate, but the fact is we are only starting now. We have the action track set up, and only this afternoon we have the first open forum, which is a listening exercise for action track number 1 on access to safe and nutritious food for everyone. And every single one of these action tracks will open fully up to openly discuss what we have. The basis of these discussions are 5 framing papers, which are online. And at this stage, which is basically until Christmas, we are simply asking the questions: did we get the framing right? Did we forget something? And we are looking for input. This is where we are. Nothing is pre-cooked. The leadership team, 5 action tracks, each one more than 30 people, approximately 150 people, comprises exactly 1 person from the World Economic Forum, 1 out of 150. Now we want to put online who is in these leadership teams, and funny enough, we are not allowed to put that on the UN website for data protection. So we are working feverishly on an online platform that gives us an open workbench for the action tracks, that all of this is being put out. All of that means our own framing papers, the input we have received, the revised framing papers, the scientific paper, the full work in full transparency. This is where we are. Now, let me start with a couple of things that I have heard. In every framing document of the Food System Summit, you will find that it starts with the notion of our food systems are broken. I think we all share the understanding that we cannot go on as we did. And the fundamental misunderstandings and the fundamental issues that we have to address here are really, and they came up. One word I haven't heard, but for me it's the central one, it's climate justice. Because we are dealing with smallholder farmers, we are dealing with people who would bear a multitude of burdens. And as the United Nations and as an SDG summit, this one is under the premise of leaving no one behind. And in order to establish climate justice, the central entry point is supporting smallholder farmers, because it makes sense in every single perspective. It makes sense out of a rights perspective, because basic human rights of these farmers are not being guaranteed. It makes sense in the climate justice perspective, because the climate impacts that smallholder farmers and indigenous people and fisher folk and forest dwellers and everybody is suffering is not caused by them. But it also makes sense because we have to balance our carbon budget. And indigenous peoples are a wonderful example on how you can live for thousands of years within a balanced carbon cycle. And it's only in the last decades that it's out of whack. Several points here. The linkage to the UNFCCC process. For me, it's a natural. I've been in climate for the last 13 years. Until recently, I was the senior director in UNFCCC. And for example, in Action Track 3, when we speak about nature positive production, which is basically the way that indigenous people are producing and that we have stopped doing, we have, for example, Tosi and Tosi Mpanu, who is one of the 2 co-chairs of SABSTA, that is looking into the Coronivia joint work on agriculture. There's a purpose in that. Biodiversity, in Action Track number 5, we have Sandrine Dixon from the Club of Rome as a vice chair, and Sandrine did fantastic work with the Leaders Pledge on biodiversity that was just making headlines a couple of weeks ago. So many good points. I need to see where to start. Well, I think Andrea quoted Olivier de Schutter saying that nothing impacts food security more than climate change. Well, yes, absolutely. And that is one of the key points why we are speaking about a food system summit, not only a food summit. Now there is the big food community. There's the Committee for Food Security that has not only done groundbreaking work for food and food systems, for example, the voluntary guidelines on tenure, which I think will be one of the key products that we are putting on the higher level with this summit, but it has always been a trailblazer for participation of civil society. Now, we have been inviting civil society all along, and maybe we haven't done that in the most apt way. So we went 3 steps back, reached out to the Committee on Food Security again, and looked into how we can intensify our cooperation. And one of the key points of the civil society mechanism is something I dare say that was never challenged. We were asking people to participate, to get their expertise in, but not to cherry pick. And so we are currently offering the civil society mechanism a institutional seat in every single action track. And institutional simple means here's the chair, you decide who will be sitting on this chair. Two more points I wanted to do. One, nature-based solutions. Yes, that gives me a stomach ache as well. We are all nature. We wouldn't even be here without nature. Nature is not a solution out there like an electric car. It's the basis of everything. And you know, this old nature-based solution space just simply will never work unless it works for the people, and people live on a piece of land. And if this is being challenged or jeopardized, doesn't bring us anywhere. Carbon capture storage, I have yet to see, after more of a decade experience in the field, a single thing that actually does work. The only carbon capture that really works is called photosynthesis, and that is with us for 3.5 billion years, and that is something that we are propagating. Should that be on the expenses of people? Hell no, it should be working for people. And in an ideal world, it helps us to give a bit more additional income for smallholder farmers. And last point, and I think Nigel will come on this one as well, it is most certainly, 3 exclamation marks, most certainly not an excuse for going on in a fossil fuel industry and keep happily burning, believing that we can offset everything and that we don't have to change. We are, and I have seen that coming over 15 years now, increasingly at a stage where we don't have any choices anymore. We need any bit of climate solution out there. We need it in parallel, we need it in tandem, and we need it as fast as ever possible. And I think framing the whole thing as a race to zero is just exactly right. And I think I spoke too long, but I give back to Ruth, and I'm very happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Important points. So I let you take some time because I think they're all very important points to touch on. But let's turn to Nigel. Nigel, I essentially have the same question for you. Responding to the hopes and the concerns raised during the previous panel discussion, what in your experience and role would you recommend the Secretariat of the COP26 presidency do in order to engage in collaborative action? What channels are there for non-state actors to engage and influence discussions amongst policymakers? And what unique elements do non-state actors bring to the table that these policy bodies can't do without?
Okay, great. Ruth, Claire, thank you so much for the framing, and thank you to the Global Alliance for Future Food and Salzburg Global Seminar for curating this dialogue. I think I'll dodge the first question because I'm not the presidency, right? My role is it's an international role mandated by the parties to work with civil society, private sector, and local government globally. And of course, the presidency's real job is to manage the negotiations, in that very formal way, along with the Secretariat. I would just say that I really appreciate your framing of this as a wicked problem, as a systemic transformation problem. It's the approach that Gonzalo and I are trying to really bring into the Marrakesh Partnership, which is the structure which we have inherited and have been mandated to improve. So I think when we publish our plans for the next stage of the high-level champions work, you'll see that some of the language around dialogue and systems transformation all over it. I hope you'll like that. I think it's also worth saying that we really understand that perhaps nowhere more than in the food system is there a complex nexus of issues: climate, food, power asymmetries, health, development issues. And I think that particularly because of those power asymmetries, a dialogue process which gives us some space. I think Milion talked about slowing down a little bit. Although this is a race, sometimes we have to slow down to listen. And I liked the way that you described that for systems transformation, we need listening, imagination, and courage, and that includes the courage to recognize that maybe one has been wrong in one's assumptions, or that something that one has been pushing hasn't worked. So just channels for non-state actors to engage. Well, it's something that Gonzalo and I are working really hard to develop. So this dialogues is part of that. I mean, this is the first that we've had now 2 weeks of Race to Zero dialogues. We very consciously, I mean, we call it a race because there's a sense of urgency. Zero's obvious. We actually like to say zero is just a staging point on the way to regenerative economies, regenerative agriculture in particular. but the dialogue is really important to us. We're not trying to have a debate where one side wins and the other side loses. We're actually trying to open up a space to respectfully listen to different perspectives, because we think that's the way that learning comes. And we're quite stuck collectively right now. We can't kid ourselves that there's a smooth pathway that we all agreed of how we unstick and solve these problems. So we've got to have that. We've got to listen. We've got to find imagination. We've got to have courage. This is one way of opening up involvement, and we've worked really hard. We maybe haven't gone far enough, but I think we've made diversity of voices a prerequisite for any partners curating these dialogues, and you've certainly carried it off beautifully. And I think you'll see across the 2 weeks we've seen more diversity than we normally have in climate conversations. We also worked very closely with Ted on the Countdown initiative, and again worked really hard to make sure there's more diversity there than normal. I think that we are publishing the second generation of net zero pathways, which Gonzalo Munoz, who of course himself is both a farmer and a circular economy pioneer and a B Corp pioneer, is my fellow champion from Chile. And so we're hoping to make those pathways dynamically part of the conversation, because we think that ultimately, unless we can converge on pathways, I think this idea of highlighting tensions and then aiming to converge in the way that Andre talked about, both civil society and private sector converging in Brazil, unless we can converge on pathways, then it's very difficult to de-risk the actions that everyone needs to take, so that we can go at the pace and scale that we need to get to. So our aim will be to use these pathways in weave dialogues with you and many other partners next year, so that by the time we get to COP, we hope that dialogue is much further advanced and the sense of converging on pathways is much further advanced. Clearly, in some sectors of the economy, we'll be able to get to convergence much faster than others, which is why I'm so pleased that the Food Systems Summit is happening next year, because I think we definitely need more attention to this part of the economy. 25% of the problem, 30% of the solution, just from a mitigations point of view, and of course crucial to resilience as well. Let me just say a couple of things about the unique role of non-state actors. I think there's lots that have been brought out. One which Teresa mentions is the sort of accountability, so to make sure we don't have one sector or one voice getting carried away thinking that it's defined something. I really agree about the need for caution with net zero, but I'd say there's two ways to be cautious. I mean, in the race to zero, we're working with Oxford University, and we think a very rigorous, transparent process to make sure that we only embrace in the race to zero initiatives which are very clear about driving real reductions in line with the science, with an emphasis on short-term action. So no 2050 targets without any 5-10 year targets, and with a rigorous approach to negative emissions, which means that they can only be considered if people are already reducing in line with the science, and then as a residual. And yes, there's definitely greenwash out there at the moment. There are definitely organizations saying we are net zero, or we are climate neutral, without any commitment to actually reduce their full value chain of emissions. So I would point to some recent papers by the Science Based Targets Initiative and by Oxford University, which lean into that question. I don't think we've finished the conversation yet, but it's a really important one. I think other things, the non-state actors really help change the politics by demonstrating practical solutions. When non-state actors converge, so when we have civil society, mayors, investors, businesses converging, it does make it much easier for policymakers to shift, because ultimately they pay a lot of attention to citizens and private sector in particular. I think also there's an opportunity to learn faster when we recognize that there's multiple levels of innovation and experimentation. I see that particularly in the work with local governments. That devolved authority often allows for faster experimentation, that can then sort of go spread learning much faster. I wanted just to finish, if you'll indulge me, with a quote, actually, because I think I've just been thinking about your principles, and about perhaps nowhere more than the food system is this transformation we're talking about a question of shared humanity. And it seems to me the quality which we, as well as of listening, imagination and courage, which requires humility to listen to others and be wrong and be prepared to admit that. I think we need a spirit of solidarity above all. And I just came across a wonderful quote by, for many of us, our great teacher in thinking about systems, Donella Meadows, who said, living successfully in a world of complex systems means expanding the horizons of caring. No part of the human race is separate either from other human beings or the global ecosystem. It will not be possible in this integrated world for the rich in Los Angeles to succeed if the poor in Los Angeles fail, or for Europe to succeed if Africa fails, or for the global economy to succeed if the global environment fails. I think the previous speakers have all said that in their own, have echoed that quote in their own words. The last thing I would say is that Gonzalo and I are really conscious that we've been able to put together a stronger team to support the non-state actor agenda within the UN construct this year because of where we sit. But the future champions and presidents will come, the next two will come from Africa and then Pacific. So we're working really hard to put in place an infrastructure that will support future champions so that the work continues rather than spiking. And in particular, we're looking to see to do what we can do to extend our team to have an African presence, to be supporting and working with the ecosystem of non-state actors in Africa, given the importance of Africa and the fact that the next presidency will come from Africa for COP27. Thank you, Ruth.
Great. Wow. And Nigel, thank you for bringing Donella Meadows into the conversation, one of my favorites.
I think all of us, right? Or anyone working in systems thinking she's one of our favorites.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. We don't have much time left, and I see that some questions have come into the Q&A and that they've been answered bilaterally, so that's great. I think maybe just to close off, a few thoughts from each of you. You have clarified the processes to some extent. You've talked about some of the missteps and some of the good steps that you've been trying to follow within each of these processes. Nigel, you talked, quite eloquently about the role of non-state actors. Some of those roles bringing forward solutions, kind of changing the dialogue and the debate. Claire asked each of our panelists, what is their call to action for these global processes? And I'd like to give you the same opportunity. On a very individual level, what is your quote unquote call to action, or what is your request of those on line today in terms of getting engaged and or really trying to influence and inform these processes in a very positive way? So maybe just a few minutes each on what you would ask of the folks listening today in terms of really trying to lead these processes in a good, positive, constructive direction. So Martin, let me start with you.
Well, thank you. And sorry, I understand I made a lot of noise with my papers before, so I won't touch them. The call to action is simply do get involved. Please do get involved inside the process, work with us, because we can guarantee and we can work to have an open and independent platform, but people have to use it. And, we have the possibility to speak about food systems as a system, and that means we have to engage everybody. And of course, this is a UN summit, so our member states are playing a strong role. But I want to emphasize two things. One is that the calls to action that will come out of the action tracks are not exclusively calls to member states. These are calls for everybody, and we will be looking in building coalitions, and we need you to build these coalitions. And the second thing I want to say is, although we are speaking about a food system summit, it really is an at least 1 year engagement process. And this process has started now, and it will come to all of the member states of the United Nations in the form of the Food System Summit dialogues. Do get involved also nationally in these dialogues. And let's work together on the synergies here so that our Food System Summit dialogues lead to strong and ambitious national determined contributions, and that the NDC discussions also help us building communities that holistically look into food systems. That would be my call to action.
Great, thank you, Martin. And Nigel, the last minute goes to you. What would you What would you put out as your request to the folks on the call today?
Well, first of all, I'll put a link in the chat. I think we've talked a bit about sources of tension or trade-offs. There's a great way of thinking about those that Bill Sharp, who's one of my systems thinking mentors, has taught me, called strategic dilemma thinking. So, for example, on the offset question, I think we want robust standards so we don't have perverse unintended consequences, but I think we might also want billions of dollars flow to forest communities, right? So let's find a way to have both of those, right? So I'll post that link. So what my call to action for next year will be every single entity in the world to join the Race to Zero, make a robust commitment to your transition, and we'll be launching a Race for Resilience soon as a sister campaign to balance those up. It really does make a difference. I already see it politically making a difference when schools, universities, sports clubs, churches, businesses, investors, cities, and regions. We think it's already had a big impact in Japan, who's now committed to net zero 2050, when they had over half of the population via their cities committing to net zero, and a couple of hundred companies putting pressure on as well. Please engage with the process that Gonzalo and I are mandated to run, the Marrakesh partnership. You know, it's open for organizations to join. Many of you on here are already part of that process. We're trying to really up the levels of energy and specificity. So engage with the pathways, tell us what's good about them and critique them. We're publishing 2.0, version 2.0 now, and we'll aim to do a 2.1 probably May or June next year. And then I think that for me, the real call to action will be commit to converging, which means listening to people you know you don't agree with, and then finding your common humanity to find where we can actually converge. Thank you, Ruth.
Great note to end on. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Martin. And with that, I will pass it back over to Claire.
Thank you, Ruth, Martin, Nigel, and all our speakers and audience for such great levels of engagement on tricky, controversial topics where we're coming at this debate from very different perspectives. Some things that stayed in my mind as I tried to wrap up. One, the need to change the narrative as well as the policy and action framework. And as we just heard from Nigel, think about changing the demand landscape. How do we make current practices and damage levels part of history, just as other things have changed in our social attitudes like smoking and so much else? Critical reappraisal of key terms, understanding how terms may have cracks in them or have been co-opted for different purposes. And to be bolder, to go beyond the doctor's mantra of first do no harm to active committed regeneration. Some critical points of action that came out, the transformation to healthy, nutritious, sustainable and low carbon food systems is our holy grail. But that requires a holistic and integrated food systems approach that really connects climate change and food security, recognizes the interconnectedness of land use, food systems, health, climate change, equity, and rights, and puts multi-stakeholder collective action and public-private collaboration as an integral part of systems change. We heard very important information about the shift to agroecological and regenerative modes of farming, the importance at the very center of those new systems of smallholder farmers and fishers, of women, of indigenous peoples with due respect for their rights and their traditional knowledge. And although that was less of a focus in this conversation, the issue of promoting less and better meat as part of our food consumption practices. Principles that Ruth highlighted at the beginning that underpin this transformation include inclusion, equity, food sovereignty, and a right to food, but also cultural respect as a foundation of collective action. Some of the specific needs that different speakers or questioners have raised, the importance of scrutinizing net zero climate targets by governments and corporations to prevent climate washing, to reassess vested interests in growth and maximizing profit versus public good and environmental and climate and social justice, to reappraise the role and the footprint of industrial agriculture, and to realign incentive mechanisms to be pro-health and pro-sustainability, understanding the win-wins and even for productive economies that go with that realignment. The importance of genuinely participatory processes that will include currently underrepresented voices. That is an imperfect summary, but it's already a very full agenda, and the people on this call and the networks they represent are fundamental to progress. I was grateful and moved that Nigel picked up on my three-worder about imagination, listening, and courage, but I pick up in turn on his reference to humility. I would also add empathy. I think that understanding that real leadership comes from many, many spaces, not only from the margins, and the courage to shift practice when you already influence the trillions is as much an act of courage as courage for real and radical change from the streets. So let us go forward with empathy, boldness, and vision. And in concluding, COVID does need to be and can be a real wake-up call. It has reminded us of our interdependence as well as systemic risk. The interconnection of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pandemic risk was not new. Scientists have drawn our attention to it for a long time, but it is now in the news. And that, I hope, can be something we harness for good to come out of these terrible risks around us right now. So thank you again for your participation. And I'd like to close by quoting a different person, a Salzburg Global Fellow, Stacey Abrams, who with others led a very important campaign of participatory engagement in the state of Georgia. And her book is called The Time Is Now. And that's what I would close with. Thank you all. And I look forward to staying involved in these discussions. Bye-bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.